In 1987, a man named Edward Calloway walked into a federal records office in Langley, Virginia, handed over a sealed envelope, and retired from the CIA after 39 years of service. Nobody noticed. Nobody was supposed to. But inside that envelope was a single typed page, a personal testimony, notarized and witnessed, describing something that happened in July of 1947 in a secured underground facility outside Roswell, New Mexico. Calloway claimed he was in the room. He claimed they made contact. He claimed the being looked back at him. And then, for 4 decades, he said nothing. Until he did. Let me tell you what Edward Calloway said happened on the night of July 9th, 1947. Not what the Air Force said. Not what the official press release from Roswell Army Airfield stated. That famous, since retracted announcement about a flying disc that was then immediately walked back and replaced with the story of a weather balloon. Not the sanitized version that has been fed to researchers, journalists, and curious citizens for nearly 80 years. No. What I want to tell you about is what one man with a 39-year career in American intelligence, claims he witnessed with his own eyes, in a room that, according to every official record, does not exist. Calloway described the room in detail. Not vague detail, precise detail. He said it was located approximately 40 feet below ground level, accessible via a freight elevator installed inside what appeared on surface maps as a water treatment annex on the southeastern edge of the Roswell base. The walls, he said, were lined with what he described as a dull metal sheeting, not quite aluminum, not quite anything I'd seen before. The lighting was low. The air was cold, noticeably colder than the desert heat above, and in the center of that room, on a surface he described as neither a table nor a bed, but something in between, lay one of the beings recovered from the crash site 2 days earlier. One of them, that word one-and, is the first place the official narrative begins to fracture. Because if there was one, where were the others? I've spent time with Calloway's 1987 testimony, not a transcript. The transcript doesn't appear in any declassified database I've been able to locate, but a second-hand rendering of it compiled by a retired defense analyst named Morton Greer, who claimed to have read the original document in 1991 before it was transferred to a restricted archive under a classification designation that, as of this writing, has never been publicly acknowledged to exist. Greer wrote about it in a privately circulated monograph, 42 pages, printed and stapled, distributed to 11 people, one of whom passed a copy to an investigative journalist in Tucson, Arizona in 2003. That journalist, a woman named Patricia Sorrell, spent 3 years trying to verify what she'd read. She died in 2006. Her files have never been recovered. Once you see the shape of this story, it becomes very difficult to look away. Calloway, according to Greer's account, was 26 years old in July of 1947. He had been with the agency, then still the OSS, transitioning into what would formally become the CIA that September, for just under 2 years. He had no particular specialty in aviation, no background in physics, no reason, on paper, to be selected for what he was about to witness. And yet, he was driven from Washington to Roswell on a military transport that made no official stops between Andrews Air Force Base and New Mexico. A journey that, he noted, took considerably less time than it should have. Why him? Why a 26-year-old analyst with no specialized clearance in aerospace or experimental technology? This raises a simple but critical question. Was he chosen for what he knew, or for what he was assumed not to know? Here is what Calloway said he saw. He said the being was approximately 4.5 feet tall, grey-toned skin, not quite grey, he clarified, but a colour that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light, something between the grey of an overcast morning and a pale, bleached blue. The head was disproportionately large. The eyes, and this is the detail that appears in every subsequent account, Calloway apparently, gave to the small number of people he confided in over the decades, the eyes were not black. Not the solid, featureless black lenses described in so many popular accounts of these beings. They were, he said, layered. Dark at the surface, but with depth behind them, like looking through tinted glass at something moving underneath. The being was alive. That is the part that stops me every time I return to this testimony. The beings described in virtually every other account from the Roswell incident, and there are more accounts than most people realize, scattered across declassified debriefing documents, retirement memoirs, and deathbed confessions that stretch from 1947 all the way to the early 2000s. Those beings are invariably described as dead, recovered, preserved, past tense. But Calloway said this one was breathing, slowly, irregularly, but breathing, and it was aware of him. He wrote, or rather Greer recorded him as having written, that the moment he entered the room the being's eyes moved to him, not toward the door, not toward the group of 4 other men who entered alongside him, directly to him, and stayed there. For the duration of his time in that room, which he estimated at between 12 and 15 minutes, the being did not look away. Why him? Again, why him? I've tried to find the names of the other 4 men in that room. Greer's monograph references them only as 2 officers, 1 civilian contractor, and 1 individual whose role Calloway either did not know or chose not to disclose. That 4th man, the one without a clear designation, appears in no other account I've encountered. His presence is noted once, briefly, and then Greer moves on as if it's unremarkable. But it isn't unremarkable. Nothing about this is unremarkable. The deeper I go into the margins of this testimony, the more I find things that don't fit the frame they've been placed in. Now we reach the part of Calloway's account that, even among researchers who take the rest of it seriously, tends to produce skepticism, because what he describes next is not visual, it is not tactile, it is not any of the conventional modes of observation that intelligence training would have prepared him for. He said the being communicated with him, not in words, not in sound at all as far as he could tell. He described it as a pressure, a word he apparently used repeatedly and then grew frustrated with, because it wasn't quite right. Not pain, not discomfort. Something more like the feeling of a thought arriving in your mind that you know wasn't there a moment ago, fully formed, sudden, like remembering something you were never told. What was communicated? This is the question that Greer's monograph circles around without ever fully answering. Calloway apparently described it differently at different times to different people, across different decades. To a former colleague he spoke to in 1974, he described it as a location, not an address, not coordinates, but a direction, like being shown where north is without a compass. To his youngest daughter, in a conversation she later recounted to Greer directly, he described it as a feeling of enormous sadness. To an unnamed researcher who contacted him in 1983, he described it as a question. A question. What question does an extraterrestrial being, alive, alone in an underground room in New Mexico, surrounded by people it had no reason to trust, ask a 26-year-old intelligence analyst who had no particular reason to be there? I don't know. Calloway apparently never said, or never said it the same way twice. And here's the strangest part. He didn't seem troubled by the inconsistency. When it was pointed out to him, according to Greer, he simply said, "It wasn't the kind of thing that translates. Every time I try to put it into words, I lose part of it." Does that sound like a man fabricating a story? Fabrications tend to be consistent, they're rehearsed, they have clean edges. What Calloway described for 40 years was something with no clean edges at all, something that resisted the very act of description. That resistance, to me, is more interesting than any particular version of what he said. The pattern that emerges across all the different framings he offered is this: he was shown something, or asked something, or given something. And whatever it was, it changed the nature of his remaining 37 years of service in ways that are, and this is where the official explanation simply collapses, never documented. Nowhere in the records that have been released, nowhere in the career summaries that can be pieced together from declassified personnel files, is there any notation of a change in Calloway's assignment, his clearance level, his area of focus, or his performance evaluations after July 1947. Not a single flag, not a single deviation. A man has an encounter with a living extraterrestrial being in a classified underground facility, and his career file reads like nothing happened at all. The silence is its own kind of evidence. I want to be careful here. I am not suggesting that Edward Calloway's account is verifiable fact. What I am suggesting is that the specific contours of what he describes, the architecture of the testimony, the way it has moved through time, the people who encountered it and subsequently disappeared from traceable records, form a pattern that is very difficult to explain as simple fabrication. Let me give you a few examples. In 1952, 5 years after the events at Roswell, a classified briefing document was apparently prepared for the incoming Eisenhower administration. This document, referred to in subsequent decades by researchers under the informal designation the November Memo, has never been officially confirmed as real, but portions of it have been referenced independently and without apparent coordination by at least 4 separate sources over the past 70 years. A retired Army signals officer who spoke to a researcher in 1968, an anonymous State Department employee who mailed a fragment of text to a journalist in 1979, a NASA contractor who mentioned it in a recorded interview in 1994, and a congressional staffer who referenced it, apparently by accident, during a 1997 background briefing before correcting himself and moving on. 4 sources, 4 decades, 0 official confirmation. The November Memo, according to these fragments, described an ongoing situation, not a past event, not a crash, a recovery and a conclusion, an ongoing situation, which implies continuity, which implies that whatever happened in July of 1947 did not end in July of 1947. Where does Calloway fit into this? Possibly nowhere, possibly at the very centre of it. He spent 37 years after Roswell working inside an agency that we now know from documents released between 2017 and 2022 was far more involved in the study of unexplained aerial phenomena than it publicly acknowledged. He worked in departments whose names appear in declassified indices, but whose actual functions are described only as analytical support, a designation so vague as to be functionally meaningless. Analytical support. For 37 years, for a 26-year-old with no aerospace background who happened to be in a room with a living extraterrestrial being and came out of it changed in ways nobody officially recorded. The evidence suggests something much larger is at work here than one man's retirement testimony. Calloway was not, it turns out, completely silent during those 40 years. He spoke. Carefully, selectively. To people he trusted, in circumstances he controlled, in language that was always just ambiguous enough to be deniable. This is itself a skill. The kind of skill a career intelligence officer develops not by accident, but by design. He knew how to say something without saying it. He knew how to leave a trail that only certain people looking in a certain way would recognize as a trail at all. Between 1949 and 1986, at least 7 individuals have been identified, by Greer, by Sorrell, and by a separate researcher working independently in the United Kingdom named Andrew Foss, whose 2011 self-published book The Calloway Margin collected what he could find, as people who heard some version of the Roswell account from Calloway directly. A former colleague from his early agency years, a neighbour in suburban Maryland who he became close to in the 1960s. 2 academics, one a physicist, one a linguist, whom he apparently sought out and befriended in the 1970s, a priest in Arlington, Virginia, his daughter, and one other individual whose identity Foss was unable to determine, referred to in his notes only as the woman in the Chicago meeting, 1981. A physicist and a linguist. Of all the people you might confide in about an experience you couldn't explain and couldn't verify and couldn't report through official channels, why a physicist and a linguist? What aspects of what happened in that room required those two specific frameworks to even begin to process? The deeper you go into the edges of this story, the more the choices start to feel deliberate, considered. Like a man who spent 4 decades not forgetting what he saw but working on it, quietly, without authorization, without documentation, without, as far as anyone has been able to determine, ever producing a single written note during all those years, until 1987, until the sealed envelope, until the single typed page. The 1987 envelope is, at this point, the most documented and simultaneously the most elusive piece of this entire story. We know it existed. Calloway's retirement from the agency is on record, a standard administrative filing, nothing unusual. Former colleagues who were still active in 1987 have confirmed in conversations with Foss and others that Calloway did bring something to the Langley Records office on his final day. One of them, a woman named only by her first name, Carol, in Foss's book, said she was in the hallway when he arrived. She said he was carrying a plain manila envelope, sealed, with a handwritten label she couldn't read from where she was standing. She said he didn't stop to talk to anyone. He handed it in and left. That envelope has not been released under any Freedom of Information request. Not because such requests haven't been filed. They have. Multiple researchers, including Sorrell before her death, submitted FOIA requests specifically seeking the retirement intake documentation for a Calloway Edward J. in 1987. The responses they received varied. Some said no records matching that description could be located. Some acknowledged the existence of a retirement file, but stated it was exempt from disclosure under national security provisions. One response, received by a researcher in Phoenix in 2008, was a single page that consisted almost entirely of black redaction bars, with only 2 phrases visible. The date of the request and, at the bottom, the words refer to originating office. What is the originating office? The response didn't say. The researcher followed up twice. No response was received. Not a bureaucratic error, not a filing gap, not a routine classification, a referral to an office that wouldn't identify itself. And here's where something becomes impossible to ignore: the uniformity of the non-response. Every researcher who has pursued this document hits a wall. Not the same wall, different walls in different places for different stated reasons. But all walls, all stopping points, all dead ends that look, from the outside, remarkably similar in their effect, if not in their form. That uniformity may tell us more than any document could. Edward Calloway died in 1993. He was 72 years old. He died in a hospice in Bethesda, Maryland, of cardiac failure. There was a small notice in the local paper, no mention of his career, and a private burial attended by family. Between 1987, when he filed his testimony, and 1993, when he died, there is a 6-year gap. 6 years during which a man who had just broken 40 years of carefully managed silence was, presumably, still alive and still capable of speaking. Did anyone official contact him? Did anyone from the agency reach out? Were there conversations, meetings, requests to elaborate or retract? Were there visits to that hospice in Bethesda that didn't make it into any visitor log? We don't know. No account exists of any official interaction with Calloway after his retirement. His daughter, who was with him when he died, gave a single interview to Foss in 2009. She said her father spent his final years at peace. She said he told her shortly before he died that he had done what he could. She said he sometimes spoke about the being in the room in Roswell, not with fear, not with the charged urgency you might expect from a man describing the defining experience of his life, but with something she could only describe as fondness. Fondness. What do you do with that? What does that tell us about what happened in that room? About the nature of whatever passed between a young American intelligence officer and a living extraterrestrial being in a cold, underground room in the New Mexico desert in July of 1947. Not terror, not trauma, not the language of a man who saw something that broke him. Fondness, like remembering a conversation with someone you wished you'd known longer. Once you sit with that word long enough, you cannot put it back where it was. I keep coming back to the same things. What was in the sealed envelope? What was the question or the direction or the feeling that the being transmitted to Calloway in those 12 to 15 minutes? Why a linguist and a physicist? What was the ongoing situation described in the November memo? What happened to Patricia Sorrell's files? Who was the woman in the Chicago meeting in 1981? What is the originating office? And the largest question of all, the one that the accumulation of all these smaller questions seems to be building toward. How much was understood? Not just by Calloway, not just by the handful of people he quietly confided in across 4 decades, but by the institutions that were in that room with him. The officers, the unnamed civilian contractor, the fourth man, the agencies they served. How much did they take away from those 15 minutes? How much did they study and classify and build upon and never share? What do we lose when we lose access to knowledge like this? Not just the testimony of one man, but whatever that man was given, or asked or shown by a being that had travelled an incomprehensible distance and ended up alive, alone, and somehow choosing to communicate with a 26-year-old analyst who had no particular reason to be there. Is it possible that the most significant exchange in human history happened in a room that doesn't officially exist, between a being that officially wasn't alive and a man whose file shows nothing out of the ordinary? Is it possible that the knowledge transmitted in those 15 minutes is sitting in a classification category that has no name, inside a building that has no public record, being studied by people whose positions have no title? Or is it possible, and I offer this not as comfort but as its own kind of haunting, that the knowledge wasn't retained? That the beings who came here understood something about us from the very beginning that we still don't understand about ourselves? That the contact wasn't an exchange so much as an assessment? That the question the being asked Calloway, whatever it was, in whatever form it arrived, in whatever way it resisted every attempt at translation for 40 years, was not a question that expected an answer? That it was a question that already had one? I don't know. Edward Calloway is gone. Patricia Sorrell is gone. The files are sealed or missing or referred to offices that don't respond. The envelope sits somewhere in a system designed to make sure that people like me, asking questions like these, never quite reach the bottom of it. But the pattern is there. It has always been there. And once you see it, really see it in its full shape, across all the decades and all the silences and all the careful, deliberate, deniable traces that one man left behind over 40 years of waiting, you don't stop looking.